All right, and before we get started with tonight, are there any questions about what we covered last week? Is there anything that y'all has been rolling around in your mind you want to follow up on or anything like that?
No, but when I went into work, they were talking about the 4 or the 5 blood moons, and I went and made a copy because I left it in my car. I had to go in my car and get it, and gave it to this lady, and she was stressed out because she saw it on TV, and I said, just read this. So she did, and she felt much better afterwards.
She felt better after
she felt much better afterwards, yeah.
Yeah, I do have some more copies of that article if anybody wasn't here last week and wants a copy of it, talking about the blood moon phenomena and those kind of things. There we go. We can.
What's this reading sometime?
Yeah, they're supposed to have like 3 more.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, 3 more.
By September next year, we'll be done.
Yeah.
Yeah, this year and next year. They're all 6 months apart. We didn't end up talking about it much last week, but I did give you the handout. Got a little bit of feedback on that handout. There were some folks that thought the article might have been a little bit harsh on Hagee in the way they talked about him and everything. So just to warn you about that ahead of time, because I do want to make sure that we're respectful and we don't want to be demeaning to people we disagree with. Because like I said before, end time speculation, that's not something that's necessarily central to the gospel. So we can have room to agree to disagree on some of those issues. So definitely want to make that clear. And there are a couple paragraphs on the second page. The guy from the Discovery Institute, he's pretty pointed with some of his remarks. So I can understand that a little bit. But I really think, as I read back over the article after I talked a little bit about that, and I really think a lot of the article is really on point, and especially as it talks about apocalyptic language and some of the danger of predicting things because of, whatever either newspaper headlines or what you see in the stars or how the moon is acting or something like that. There's just a lot of danger in those kinds of things. We usually end up in bad places, and there's usually not a whole lot of good that comes out of those. So I do still want to commend to you the idea that this teaching about the 4 blood moons is not something that we should put much stock in or much confidence in at all. There's just really not much to it. Do you want just a brief cliff notes? There have actually been, this will be the 8th time that this has happened in history since the time of Jesus, where they've had these 4 lunar eclipses and they've all fallen on Jewish holidays. The 4 lunar eclipse thing has happened 62 times. It's fallen on Jewish holidays. This will be the 8th time that that's happened. And Hagee's analysis is that when this happens, major things happen having to do with the Jewish people. That's his argument. The problem is that the first 4 or 5 of them, nothing happened. There's really nothing that you can point to at all historically. So he picks up in 1492 and says the expulsion of Jews from Spain is a great example of a major event that happened to the Jewish people. But the reality is Jews were living all over Europe at that time. That's not an especially large number of Jewish people in comparison to those that were living all across the world at the time. So it's not even apparent that that's a major event for the Jewish people. The date doesn't exactly line up on that either. The next one is 1949 and 50, which the creation of the Jewish state was in 1948. So again, your dates are a little bit off. The event actually happened before the blood moon stuff. So if you were paying attention to blood moon, you would have been late anyway. So I think that's another indication that this really isn't something that's like foretelling events that are going to happen. And then there's the one in 67 or 68 or so when there was a war during that time period. So that's one of the issues, is that really only maybe 2, maybe 3 of the 7 that we've had so far have really actually seen anything that you could even possibly classify as something major happening to Jewish people. So number one, it doesn't hold up to even a moderate amount of scrutiny, just the basic thesis of it. Another problem is that these lunar eclipses, even though there are 4 of them at different places in the world, none of these can be seen from the same place. If we were just looking at the moon, we would not know this happened.
Right.
From Israel or from any other vantage point in the world. There are eclipses, and we know that because of scientific research that we can do now, but maybe in the 1900s they could have found this out, but earlier in human history they just would have had no idea that this was going on. So the idea that God is trying to communicate, in 1492, when that there are eclipses in different parts of the world on these feast days, it just doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. And probably the thing that I think is most important is that in the Old Testament, the Bible roundly condemns astrology as a way of looking at the future or trying to understand happenings in the world, things like that. The stars and the planets do move in the sky, and people throughout human history have recognized that and seen that. Genesis 1:14 even talks about the days and the months would be determined by the stars, and what that means is that they use the lunar calendar. Every time the moon was new, that was a new month for them. You run into some problems with that because it doesn't work out to be an exact year, so you got to go redo some figure. That's why we got months with 31 days and 28 days and everything.
Every 7 years they added a month.
Okay, yeah. So
You got kind of like we do week year, they did week month.
Yeah.
Every 7 years.
So you got to account for some of those things. It doesn't line up perfectly, but as a whole, it helps out a lot to know those kind of things. But as far as telling prophecy from the events in the stars or things like that, the Old Testament repeatedly says that's what the pagan nations do, that's what the Gentile nations do, and tells Israel you are not to be involved in that you're to listen to God through His Word and through His prophets in these kind of ways, not through the stars. So I think we're treading on some dangerous territory when we start looking at moons and eclipses and things and trying to determine some kind of meaning out of those. The one time in the Bible that you could say that really did happen was the Star of Bethlehem. But if you think about that, what's happening there is that's not particularly a message to Israel and God's people who have His Word and know not to look at the stars for those kind of things. That was a message to Gentile astrologers. How else was the message of the birth of Israel's king going to get to people outside of Israel other than God accommodating the way that they looked for revelation? So I think that's more of a one-time exception, that God did it that way in order to illustrate for us that the gospel was going to be for the nations, and you have these Gentile, foreign nation magi, astrologers, traveling to meet Israel's Messiah and find out salvation comes from Israel. That's where he's going to be found. So, like I said, I think that's more of a one-time exception, and nowhere else in the Bible are we told. I mean, can you think of any place in the New Testament that recommends looking at the stars or the moon to figure out when Jesus is coming back or things like that? It's completely absent. We're told to be on our guard at all times, always be ready for His return, be watchful, because it could happen at any time. And while we're waiting, we're supposed to be about personal holiness and following Christ and living out His Word in this world. So,
And I think it was very clear to communicate, no one knows the hour.
yeah,
So don't waste your time trying to predict
right,
all of that. Focus on me
yeah,
and what I am right here, right now in your life.
yeah, that's great.
Plus, we need to worship the God who made the stars, not the stars.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah, that's right. Yeah, and
Or one of the stars.
there's a fine line there, and the two actually run together in the thinking of, especially of the Old Testament, because there are some passages that talk about not worshiping the stars, and they don't talk particularly about fortune telling or divination, these kinds of things specifically there. But all of that is wrapped in together, and it's almost inseparable. So even those passages that don't say specifically, don't try to tell the future from the stars or the planets, even those are, they're still talking negatively about this whole idea that we look at the stars for guidance and things like that. So, and doing a little bit of research on it this week, because I did get some questions on it. I did run across a few instances where John Hagee himself has been involved in predicting some things that turned out to be not true. In 1996, he predicted that the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin of Israel would produce a peace treaty in the Middle East, and this was going to usher in the rapture and the tribulation. He said that this was going to put us on the fast track for prophecy to be fulfilled. But everybody has a short memory. People forget about that unless you actually go back and read it. Then in 99, he said that the Y2K bug was going to cause huge disaster, and this was going to be the thing that was going to usher in the end times. 2008, he wrote a book about the financial collapse and said that the financial collapse was going to lead to the world seeking one world ruler to rescue us from the financial collapse, and this was going to be the Antichrist. So, when you look back at a history of predictions like this, you're kind of like, it'd probably be better if we skipped on to the next subject and left that one alone for a little while. So, yeah, definitely want to, you don't want to be demeaning to people that disagree and have different opinions. But when sometimes disagreements cross over into some areas that are a little bit dangerous, and I think this is getting into the dangerous area when we start getting into these kinds of things.
There's a difference between disagreements, and then there's a difference between just heresy.
Yeah.
On
Well, that's
some
true.
other-
And it's a
I'm not talking about his end time stuff, that's, but.
Yeah. It's a tough question sometimes. If you have like a scale of 1 to 10,
Yeah.
and 0 is like perfect Bible teaching, and 10 is like off the wall heresy. It's like when somebody's like a 4 or a 5 in there, you don't want to completely condemn them.
No.
Because there may be some good things that they're saying, but you also want to caution about some of the things that they're saying as well. And that's just the space we're in there.
We thought, I don't want to take him like that. I think Hagee's probably an 11 on that scale. And it has nothing to do with his blood moves or anything.
Well, he does, in the research I did, it did talk a little bit, and the article even talks a little bit about how he believes that they're different. The Jewish people are saved by keeping the law, and Christians are saved by the gospel, by faith in the gospel. And that is a pretty problematic teaching. I'm not sure how far he carries that. I would want to hear him speak for himself on what he believes on that before I made strong statements about that. But that is a concerning teaching if that is what he's teaching and what he's involved in. So yeah, but I wouldn't put much stock in the blood moon thing. Now it may be that something major happens with Israel. If you look at the newspaper and what's happening in the Middle East, it may well be. But I'm not quite sure that the lunar phases have much to do with it.
Well, the main focus right now is the Jews in Ukraine.
Yeah.
It seems to be kind of heating up there for them.
Yeah. And but every year or two, there are newspaper headlines that things are ramping up and this could be a disaster, this could be very concerning in the nation of Israel. And fortunately, most of the times lately, they've been diffused when, Hamas is launching rockets and Israel's responding, and you're wondering how much is this going to escalate. They stay on the brink of some pretty serious stuff happening over there all the time. So, and we pray that it won't, because we don't want to see those kinds of things happen. All right, probably more than enough about blood moons, right? Let's talk about prophecy.
Let's don't forget to try to see the next one in October.
Okay. Yeah, were you the one that said you got up to see it?
The 2 and
2 in the morning?
It was nothing.
Well, it's
But
cloudy.
somebody else said they got up at 4
Okay.
and they were able to see just something.
Some
but not
glimpses,
much.
yeah, I heard it was very overcast.
Yeah, it was
Okay.
overcast at
Yeah.
2.
Yeah. I mean, what do you do if God's sending you signs by the moon and it's cloudy?
Exactly.
How do you figure that out?
You're not meant to receive this one.
Here's what we were talking about last week with prophecy, just to give you some bullet points. What we said last week, direct predictions and fulfillments are a minority among biblical prophecy. We are not normally looking for, on June 15th of this year, you're going to get a flat tire on the side of the road. We're not looking for specific things like that normally. Now, there are a few instances of things like that happening and prophecies like that in the Bible, but the vast majority are not direct fulfillment and direct prophecies. Much more often, we see themes and repetitive events happen, similar events happen a number of different times. Scripture interprets other scriptures, so we want to pay close attention to cross-references and other places in the Bible that use the same kind of imagery and same kind of themes. And then make sure that we have our symbolism radar really turned up, because we know that prophecy involves a lot of symbolism. It speaks in metaphors and similes and all kinds of figurative language. So we need to expect that and not necessarily always say that I'm looking for the literal fulfillment of this prophecy. In fact, the prophecies we looked at last week, we noted that I think each one of them were not fulfilled in a strictly literal sense, if you were talking about them. And these are the ones we looked at last week. Genesis 2:17, but you must not eat from the tree, for on the day you eat of it, you will certainly die. So that was one, and we said no, they didn't die on that day. Death entered the world. They did eventually die. Their sons Cain killed Abel. So this is death entering the world. Death entered the world for all of us, spiritual death as well. And so not only did we see kind of multiple fulfillments of it, but a growing fulfillment of it. That the wages of sin is death, but the gift of God is eternal life. So death does enter the world the moment that they eat, even though their physical death is not like the original prophecy sounded like. Next one that we looked at was Genesis 3:15. He will crush your head and you will strike his heel, the prophecy about Jesus. And we talked about how there were multiple times in the Bible that we could see elements of this being fulfilled. And ultimately we believed it happened decisively at the cross. But you could look at the temptation of Jesus as one example of Satan injuring Jesus, but Jesus actually overcoming Satan. The cross being another great example. Jesus was obviously greatly injured by the cross, physically speaking, and spiritually speaking, as the wrath of God was poured out on him for our sins. But Jesus ultimately rose from the dead and came out victorious in the cross and resurrection. And even the Gospel of John really pictures the entire cross event as Jesus' victory. So even though it is his death, Jesus is being glorified in the very event of his death. So we see it there. And then in the end of Revelation, when Jesus triumphs, comes back riding on a white horse, and Satan is thrown into the lake of fire, there's going to be a final victory. Satan's going to try to put together this huge battle and try to strike his heel again, but Jesus is going to slay his enemy by the sword that comes out of his mouth in Revelation 19 and be ultimately defeated in Revelation 20. So again, we've seen a prophetic theme that grows and really helps us understand and put together the entire storyline of the Bible. Really fascinating way, I think, of looking at prophecy and reading it, and not trying to look for newspaper headlines and all these specific Nostradamus-type prophecies, and Mayan calendar ends in 2012 as this the end of the world. We're not getting to that kind of thing. That's not what biblical prophecy looks like. This is much more theologically rich, and it's really cool to see how it all points and centers around Christ. Even back from the earliest chapters of the Bible, we are seeing the gospel played out in front of our very eyes in the prophecies that are being made there. Deuteronomy 18, the prophet that was predicted that Jesus was the ultimate fulfillment of, but we said that Israel also had other prophets that constituted smaller fulfillments of that. So, we got to Isaiah 7:14 last week too. The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and saw how there was an immediate fulfillment of that a young woman did conceive and give birth to a son. Mahar Halal al-Hashbaz in chapter 8, there's an immediate fulfillment, and then the ultimate fulfillment in Jesus being born of the Virgin Mary. So that brings us to Matthew 24. We're getting to the New Testament tonight, so open up your Bibles to Matthew 24. This is one of the major New Testament prophetic passages. Jesus tells us what to look for at the end times, what's all going to be wrapped in together when these final days are approaching. Matthew 24. This is a long passage, so I don't want to read the whole thing, but feel free to scan through it while we're talking. Let me read you a couple notable sections of it. The question that's being answered there is asked in verse 3. As Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately. Tell us, they said, when will this happen, and what will be the sign of your coming and the end of this age? Before that, he had told them that not a stone would be left of the temple, and that's what prompts this question. Then Jesus goes on to say, many will come in my name claiming I am the Messiah, so there will be false messiahs, false people claiming to be Jesus. See examples of that every here and there. Van sent me a website just yesterday. Somebody came knocking on his door telling him that Jesus was...
Their pastor is the, quote, appointed Son of God.
Their pastor?
Yeah, their pastor was Jesus.
The Spirit of Jesus. Jesus is his literal father. He's just the Spirit of Jesus. Anyway.
Yeah. So,
Put that on your application, huh?
yeah.
See, Jesus' son, or
They're trying to sell you donuts.
Trying to sell you
Donuts.
Yeah. So many will come in my name, falsely claiming I am the Messiah, and will deceive many. You will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See to it you are not alarmed. Such things must happen, but the end is still to come. Nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these are the beginnings of birth pains. Then you will be handed over to be persecuted and put to death. You will be hated by all nations because of me. At that time many will turn away from the faith and will betray and hate each other. And many false prophets will appear and deceive many people. Because of the increase of wickedness, the love of most will grow cold, but the one who stands firm to the end will be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. So when you see standing in the holy place the abomination that causes desolation, spoken of through the prophet Daniel, let the reader understand. Let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let no one on the housetop go down to take anything out of the house. Let no one in the field go back to get their cloak. How dreadful it will be in those days for pregnant women and nursing mothers. Pray that your flight will not take place in the winter or on the Sabbath, for then there will be great distress, unequaled from the beginning of the world until now, and never to be equaled again. If those days had not been cut short, no one would survive, but for the sake of the elect, those days will be shortened. At that time, if anyone says to you, look, here is the Messiah, or there he is, do not believe it. For false messiahs and false prophets will appear and perform great signs and miracles to deceive, if possible, even the elect. See, I have told you ahead of time. So if anyone tells you, there he is out in the wilderness, do not go out. Or here he is in the inner rooms, do not believe it. For as lightning comes from the east, is visible even in the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Wherever there is a carcass, the vultures will gather. Immediately after the distress of those days, the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give its light. The stars will fall from the sky and the heavenly bodies will be shaken. That's some good Old Testament apocalyptic imagery like we were talking about. Then will appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, and then all the peoples of the earth will mourn when they see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. So this is the visible, glorious appearing of Jesus that's being described here. And he will send his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of the heavens to the other. Now learn this lesson from the fig tree. As soon as its twigs get tender and its leaves come out, you know that summer is near. Even so, when you see all these things, you know that it is near, right at the door. Truly I tell you, and this is a tough verse right here, okay? Truly I tell you, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. But about the day or hour, no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. As it was in the days of Noah, so it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. He goes on from there. So a lot of different things to talk about in those verses, but you get a general picture of what it's going to look like in the last days. And I want to say, probably as we get started, that the Bible looks at the time since Jesus' ascension as the last days. We are in the last days today. They were in the last days in AD 33, when Jesus ascended back to heaven, and 40 days later, the Feast of Pentecost, the Holy Spirit came. They were in the last days then. And they quoted last day prophecies. at Pentecost. Joel chapter 2 is quoted in Peter's speech there in his sermon. So they were in the last days there. We are in the last days today. The last days is not best thought of as a ticking clock counting down to zero. It's better pictured as a period of time and a way that the world is functioning, where the things described here by Jesus are happening. Because we can look down at this list and say, well, that's happening today. But you know what? People 50 years ago looked down at this list and said, hey, this is happening today. It could be in this lifetime. In fact, my mom told me when I was a kid, I remember saying this, I really think Jesus is going to come back in your lifetime. And I think the reason she said that was because she had heard people talk about prophecies like this and about Bible prophecy in general. And it looks, we read the newspaper and we see the headlines, and it's like, surely what's going on now is the fulfillment of Bible prophecy. But Jesus has been saying this Jesus said this 2,000 years ago, and people of almost every generation have seen things in their own time that they say, hey, it looks like this could be it. So that's one reason to put the brakes on a little bit when we get to prophecy. But at the same time, I don't want to take away from the fact that Jesus is saying that there's going to be a suddenness and an unexpectedness to his coming that's going to surprise people. He says we can look for signs and we can know that there are indications that the time is getting close. But we're not going to be able to accurately predict the time, and it's going to surprise people. People are going to be standing out in the field, one person's going to be taken, one person's going to be left. That's the suddenness of the coming of Jesus. Okay? So just to give you kind of some overview on this. Now, how do some of the prophetic principles we've been talking about apply to this? Well, this is a really vivid illustration of the fact that there are very likely at least multiple fulfillments of this prophecy. Because back in AD 70, the temple was destroyed. And that's ultimately what prompts this question, right? When are the stones going to be overturned? And not one stone is going to be left on another. Jesus gives descriptions of a lot of things that are going to happen. And there's a lot of ways that you can see these descriptions fulfilled when the Romans came and destroyed the temple. An abomination of desolation, something that had happened in the temple that desecrated the temple. It had happened in the 100s BC. Something similar had happened in about 40 AD. But then in 70 AD, the temple was completely destroyed. And sacrificial system was done away with. Multiple places that we see an abomination of desolation. Some people think we need to look for that at the end times. Maybe there will be a temple rebuilt, and we'll see another one of those types of things. And that's something that may be a possibility. I certainly wouldn't take the evidence in the Bible and stack that up and say that must happen. Some people would, from a different prophetic stream than me. But it's something that it certainly seems possible from the evidence that's there. So here's the interesting thing about this one. When you get to verse 15, he talks about the abomination that causes desolation. He says, let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. What happened was in 70 AD, when the Romans were about to destroy the temple, was that a lot of Christians actually listened to this prophecy and got out of Judea, and their lives were spared because of what happened. So there is at least some fulfillment of what Jesus is talking about here in AD 70, which would be within one generation, within the same generation of the people that Jesus is talking to here. Jesus is saying this probably at 32, 33 AD. And what did Jesus say in 34? This generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened. So there are some aspects of this that you could say, at least in beginning form, were fulfilled in AD 70. Now, some Christians have tried to make this all about the future. And I don't think that'll work, because there's clear fulfillment of this in AD 70. And the fact that people knew to leave Jerusalem because of this very prophecy is a strong argument that says some of this was going on in AD 70. Now, other Christians have said, well, all of this stuff that talked about in Matthew 24, all of it happened in AD 70. It's all been completely fulfilled. There's nothing left that needs to happen in the future. And I don't buy that one either. The description of Jesus coming on the clouds in glory. While apocalyptic language can sound like that at times, and Jesus does come in judgment, and this destruction of the temple in 70 AD is very, I think, correctly looked at as judgment on the nation of Israel for not receiving Jesus as their Messiah. So this is an act of judgment through Titus and through the Roman conquerors that destroyed the temple. But to say that this prophecy is completely fulfilled in that event, I think just leaves you really wanting more. And saying that this event here sounds like there's a lot more to it than what's going on. The elect being gathered from the four corners of the earth. I mean, how does that fit in? It just doesn't seem like you can. Some people try to kind of shoehorn it in there, but I don't think it works. So what you end up with here is some aspects of the prophecy that were fulfilled already in AD 70, and then some that are going to be fulfilled at the second coming, I think is the best way to see it. And probably some elements of that were fulfilled in both places. You'll see very similar kinds of things and fulfillments at both of those instances. And here's one of the ways that I think you put this together as far as Jesus saying all these things are going to take place within this generation. Just a couple verses later, he says, but about that day or hour, no one knows, not even the angels or heaven, nor the Son, only the Father. And then he says in the next verse, as it was in the days of Noah, so it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. So I think he's actually giving us some clues here that there are two different events that are going on here. And that one is going to happen completely all in the events of AD 70. And the other thing that he's talking about here is the coming of the Son of Man, and nobody knows when that's going to be. So I think that's some of how you put that puzzle together. Some people have really harped on that verse and said, see, the Bible can't be true because everything that was prophesied in Matthew 24 didn't come true within the generation. Jesus expected to return, and Paul expected his return within that generation. They were all disappointed, so that means the Bible is not true. But I think that's putting way too much weight in not understanding the way that Bible prophecy normally works, and that we see sometimes a very close fulfillment and then also a distant fulfillment of the very same prophecy, like the Isaiah passage as well. So, that's
What would you say to this? He says, truly I tell you, not one stone here will be left on another. Every one will be thrown down, but the western wall still stands.
Yeah, I mean, at that point, you're just arguing about what part of the temple is. Yeah, would the Western Wall have actually been considered part of the temple or just the temple building itself? You know, I mean, you can get into a lot of minutia. And really, prophecy is like a black hole. Mm-hmm. It really is like that. Because even in doing my research for this week, and last week some, every one of these prophecies, you could spend so much time studying just this one passage. And it will send you down rabbit trail after rabbit trail after rabbit trail. And I've got to study the abomination of desolation and Daniel and understand that. And that's a whole other issue on its own. And then I got to understand the AD 70 thing. And then I got to understand some of these other verses that are quoted. And it's complicated. It's endless. You can really just frustrate yourself trying to put all of this together. And that's one good indication that when somebody comes to you and tells you that they've got Bible prophecy pretty much figured out, and here, read this book, and I'll tell you how it's all going to end, that should set up some warning signs. It's kind of like the more you know about a subject, the more you realize that you have a lot more to learn. Right. And whatever you do for a living, whatever you know a lot about, there are people that know a little bit about that subject that could really oversimplify a statement about that. Like if you know about building houses, and somebody comes up to you and says, "You use 2x4s to build houses." I know. I've seen a wall. And you're like, "Well, yeah, kind of. You do use 2x4s sometimes, but there's times you use other sizes of lumber." You know, it's not that they're wrong, but it's that they don't have the whole picture there. And that's kind of what you get in prophecy a lot of times. Is somebody comes, "I've figured it all out. I've got this." And it's like, yeah, but you ignored these 5 other things in that passage that you haven't really dealt with, and you haven't come up with a satisfactory explanation there. So it's a tough situation, and we could spend an entire Wednesday night series just talking about one prophecy and tracing out all the different rabbit trails that you could follow with that. So just trying to give you a quick overview. Some of the passages that are discussed here. Daniel chapter 9, 11, and 12 all talk about the abomination of desolation. And that's one that's referred to here. So you can go back to Daniel and get a little bit more information about that, see what's going on there. And that is another confusing. Daniel's a tough book. It takes some study and some work to go through that one.
It's the most accurate book in the Bible, though, I think, for prophecy. Because Alexander the Great, who's clearly prophesied chapter 7, or no, 8, when he was conquering the known world. And, I looked this up because I heard somebody say it and I looked it up. And it's a fact that he didn't conquer Jerusalem. And the reason he left Jerusalem alone is because somebody showed him he was prophesied 400 years earlier in the book of Daniel. And he kind of, okay, I'm going to leave their God alone. Basically, and he left Jerusalem alone. Now his generals, after he died, went and conquered, and that's where the first abomination took place.
Yeah.
And actually, even though it's not inspired scripture, so don't misunderstand me, but the book of Maccabees in the Apocrypha actually has a pretty good historical account of that particular event.
Right.
The Maccabean, whatever, rebellion.
Yeah.
There's a really good account of that.
Yeah.
If anybody's interested in reading it.
Yeah. And we talked a little bit about the Apocrypha and why we don't believe it's scripture. There is interesting historical information in there. So while it's not we don't believe it's inerrant and inspired like the Old and New Testaments, it's still interesting to read sometimes, particularly the intertestamental history. Yeah. And then Daniel 7, I think that, I gotta look there and remind myself what Daniel 7 is. You can look there with me if you want to.
The Son of Man coming.
I thought that's what it was, but I wasn't sure. One like the Son of Man coming on the clouds in glory. Daniel 7, 13 and 14. In my vision at night I looked, and there before me was one like a Son of Man, coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. He was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All nations and peoples of every language worshiped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. So, yeah, I was doing a little bit of research on these, and I was like, man, I got to preach to Daniel sometime. So a little bit intimidating to try, but I think it'd be interesting and to be able to look at it and understand it from a different perspective than probably a lot of people have, where you're like counting the weeks and trying to figure out when the rapture is going to be, those kind of things. Because normally I find that when I go back and look at passages like that, there's really a lot that's there, and they're really edifying passages in a lot of different ways other than just the end time speculation. There's really a lot of theological weight there that's really beneficial to learn. Revelation is a lot like that. If you go to Revelation mainly looking for, what's the first thing that's going to happen after the rapture, or how many years is this event going to be, 3.5 years or what, you really miss, I think, a lot of the blessing that God has for us in the book of Revelation, because it's a fantastic, fascinating book, but getting wrapped up in all the details about what order everything's going to happen in it's really not the point. It's not why John wrote it. And there are some things that you can learn from that in there, but you're just getting off track if that's where your main focus is with it.
All right. You just said people oversimplify things, which is true, but I think the other side of that coin is people also overcomplicate them. God's not the author of confusion, and the book of Revelation is just that. It's a revelation. It's something being revealed. Therefore, if God's revealing something to his people, one would think that he didn't confuse it, you know what I mean? So
yeah, well, the question becomes more, what is he revealing in the book of Revelation? And I would argue that what he is revealing is something that has a lot more historical value to the original readers than speculation about the order of end time events, which would have been maybe interesting for them, but not really useful in a context where they're enduring persecution and tribulation and things like that. Revelation is really written to encourage and to say that Christ has won, even though he conquered by laying down his life. And the church may be called to do the same thing. The church may be called to lay down their lives, sacrifice, but that's exactly how we conquer. We become conquerors by dying. And that's what the church was going through at the time. And the Revelation, and John's Revelation is a picture over and over again of this truth that God is the sovereign ruler, he's the coming king, and that he will not be defeated, and that his church can be encouraged regardless of what kind of trials and tribulation it is going through. So I think that's, well, in fact, Revelation is our next verse. I feel like there's a lot more we could talk about with Matthew 24, but I don't want to get stuck here too much longer. Unless you guys have a specific question about something in Matthew 24. The main thing that I wanted you to see was that there was some fulfillment in AD 70, but there's also fulfillment yet to come at the second coming of Jesus. And it's all wrapped up here together. And sometimes it's hard to pull it all apart and say this is here and this is there. Some parts are obvious, some parts may go to both. We just go down the wrong path if we're taking this verse and putting it here and this verse and putting it over here. What we want to see out of these is the themes and the power of God and his character clearly shown throughout human history, that he has a plan and a purpose, that God the Father knows the exact time that it's coming, and it's not going to come a moment sooner or a moment later than what he plans and ordains for it to happen. He's got perfect time. And we can be assured that Jesus really is coming back. All right, let's look at Revelation 7. So this one's our last example. Can't talk about prophecy without talking a little bit about Revelation, right?
Yeah, to pick this
I love Revelation chapter 7.
Yeah,
I think
awesome.
I think it's an incredible picture.
I
And
got
what?
stuck in a 7-hour van trip with a Jehovah's Witness and this verse. So I'm very confused about it.
Ask him why they keep changing it.
First off, why are we in
It worked until it was more than
It was the
144,000 Jehovah's Witnesses.
and then they,
Ah,
They had to change it.
yeah, what do you think that one?
yeah.
So one of the main questions in Revelation 7 is, who is the 144,000? That's the one y'all mentioned. That's the one I got here on the slide. Let's look down at Revelation 7. And he says, after this I saw 4 angels standing at the 4 corners of the earth, holding back the 4 winds of the earth to prevent any wind from blowing on the land or the sea on any tree. Then I saw another angel coming up from the east, having the seal of the living God. He called out in a loud voice to the 4 angels who had been given power to harm the land and trees. Do not harm the land or the sea or trees until we put a seal on the foreheads of the servants of our God. Then I heard the number of those who were sealed, 144,000 from all the tribes of Israel. And then it gives 12,000 from each of the 12 tribes, which 12,000 multiplied by 12 is 144,000. So that's where you get the name. The sealing comes from Ezekiel chapter 9. Let's look at that passage. This is one of those places that you really have to know some Old Testament background. Really the whole book of Revelation. If you don't know the Old Testament background, you're really going to be at a real disadvantage trying to interpret what Revelation is saying.
Ezekiel 9.
Ezekiel chapter 9. A lot of background from Revelation comes from Ezekiel and Daniel.
Good rock performance of those agreement.
So Ezekiel chapter 9, let me read this to you for the sake of time. Then I heard him call out in a loud voice, bring near those who are appointed to execute judgment on the city, each with a weapon in his hand. And I saw 6 men coming from the direction of the upper gate, which faces north, each with a deadly weapon in his hand. This is starting to be kind of an ominous passage, right? Deadly weapons, somebody's coming to execute judgment. Within was a man clothed in linen who had a writing kit at his side. They came in and stood beside the bronze altar. Now the glory of God of Israel went up from above the cherubim where it had been and moved to the threshold of the temple. Then the Lord called to the man clothed in linen who had the writing kit at his side, and he said to him, go throughout the city of Jerusalem and put a mark on the foreheads of those who grieve and lament over all the detestable things that are done in it. So the mark on the forehead is going to be written by this guy, and it's only going to be written on the foreheads of the people who are grieving and repenting over the sin that's going on in Jerusalem. That's the idea there. It's the people that are faithful to God, and who are grieved by the fact that there's lots of sin going on. Verse 5, as I listened, he said to the others, follow him through the city and kill without showing pity or compassion. Slaughter the old men, the young men, and the women, the mothers and children, but do not touch anyone who has the mark. Begin at my sanctuary. So they begin with the old men who were in front of the temple. Wow. So they go through and kill everyone who doesn't have the mark. This is God's judgment on the city. For God's people have been marked, they're safe, and everybody else is judged.
And that was a vision he had, right?
Yeah.
That wasn't a literal.
Right, yeah, that's a vision. But that vision is what's being picked up here with the sealing of God's people. God's judgment is coming. We've seen the beginnings of that in chapter 6 as the seals are open. The first 6 seals are open. Then we take a break in chapter 7. Then in chapter 8, the 7th seal is open, which really turns into the bowls of wrath, or the trumpets, I'm sorry. The 7 trumpets really end up going with that 7th seal. So in the midst of God's judgment, God's people are going to be protected and kept safe with this seal on their forehead, just like they were back in Ezekiel chapter 9. And they are told to seal the 144,000. So a lot of people think, well, it talks about 12,000 from each tribe, so these must be Jewish people that are going to be sealed. And the way this works out in the dispensational system is the church is raptured at the beginning of the tribulation, normally. And then the tribulation mainly has to do with Jewish people. So these are Jewish people that are marked on the forehead, the ones that are faithful. And this passage is one of the strong arguments for this being a Jewish time period. Well, these 144,000 Jews are marked during this time. What's going on? I think there's some different problems with that, especially when you interpret it in the context of the whole of Revelation chapter 7. So look at chapter 9, after the 144,000 are sealed. After this I looked, and there before me was a great multitude that no one could count, from every nation, tribe, people, and language.
Verse 9.
Where are
You
you?
said chapter 9, verse 9.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Chapter 7, verse 9.
Revelation?
Yeah, Revelation again. Revelation 7, verse 9. After this I looked, and there before me was a great multitude that no one could count, from every nation, tribe, people, and language, standing before the throne and before the Lamb. So what your initial thought is, well, this is a different group, because the 144,000 were Jewish, and this is a group from every tribe and nation and language. So these are people from all over the world. So it sounds like a different group, right? But wait a minute. They were wearing white robes and were holding palm branches in their hands. They cried out in a loud voice, salvation belongs to our God who sits on the throne and to the Lamb. Go down a little bit farther. Verse 13. Then one of the elders asked me, these in white robes, who are they? Where did they come from? So who is this? Is it a new group of people? I answered, sir, you know. And he said, these are they who have come out of the great tribulation. But wait a minute. If this was the church from before, the church, if in the dispensational system, the church was raptured before the tribulation. They didn't come out of the great tribulation. So we run into a roadblock here.
They say these are the tribulation saints. Those who were saved after the rapture.
Yeah. There's all kinds of different ways you can try to get around it. But here's the problem. This is talking about a multitude from every tribe and nation and language that has come out of the Great Tribulation. And by the way, I don't think you should think of the Great Tribulation, capital G, capital T, like it's some set time period. There's really only one place, I think this is the only place in the New Testament, that talks about the Great Tribulation. There are a couple other places that talk about Great Tribulation, but it's just in the generic sense of a time of Great Tribulation. So I don't think that you're on the right track in the first place when you think of like the first 3.5 years of the tribulation as the regular tribulation, and then the second half is the Great Tribulation. That terminology doesn't hold up.
How about all 7?
All 7 could be the Great Tribulation. Well, and ultimately, I think that is the greatest period of tribulation. But I think the way that Revelation is talking about the entire age from the time that Jesus ascended to the time of his return is a time of tribulation for the church. And these are those that are coming out of this great tribulation of the day that we live in fact. And why do I say that? Keep going. These are they who have come out of the great tribulation. They have washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. That is a key statement here, and it's what ties chapter 7 together. They have washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. For our cross-references here, Numbers chapter 31, we don't have time to turn there, but this is the instructions for an army washing their robes after a holy war. So after war, there would be a ceremonial cleansing after battle. And this kind of ceremonial cleansing is exactly what's being described in the second part of verse 14. They have washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. They have gone through battle. They've come through the great tribulation. They have survived, and they're now standing before the throne, and they're worshiping, and they've washed their robes after this great battle that they've been a part of. They're doing battle just like we are doing battle now. We're doing battle with spiritual forces in the darkness of this age, and our brothers and sisters around the world are actually enduring physical persecution in some countries. They are going through the great tribulation. They are going to stand before the throne of God one day with white robes, and they're going to sing these songs, and the answer is going to be, who is this? It's going to be those that have come out of the great tribulation. They've washed their robes white. They've gone through this cleansing. And the reason that ties chapter 7 together is because that's why the beginning part of chapter 7, you have a count of 12,000 from each tribe of Israel, and 144,000 total. Why would you have counted people? In the Bible is a census, which David gets in trouble for because he was measuring his what? Military might. By doing the census, he was finding out how many warriors, how many men of fighting age he had. So the beginning of chapter 7 is counting a census of the believers in the world who are about to go into spiritual battle.
Are you saying that different people in different places can go through tribulation
Yeah.
at different times?
Yeah, absolutely.
So then how do you account for
And they certainly do. We know that. We know that for a fact. The question is this only talking about a specific end time period? And I'm saying that John is looking at the tribulation as a time from Jesus' ascension all the way through.
So are you saying the 144,000 is this great multitude?
Yeah, it's the same group.
Well, it's numbered 144,000, but
Right.
then it says that no one could number.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And then in Revelation 9, when the wrath's being poured out, the fifth angel sounds his trumpet, they were told not to harm the grass on the earth, the locust, right? Or any plant or tree, but only those people who did not have the seal of God on their forehead. So they're still on earth in chapter 9, and the seal is to protect them from the wrath of God as he's pouring it out on the unbelieving world.
Yeah. The sealing and many other symbols in Revelation are about God's spiritual protection of his people, even in the midst of physical persecution. That's what the sealing's a protection of, is a picture of. That's what measuring the temple is a protection of later on in the book. Lots of different symbols in Revelation talk about spiritual protection of God. That even though you may be going through persecution, even though you're going through holy war, in a sense, but I don't mean physical battle by that at all. I mean that's strictly spiritual battle where you're doing, you're enduring, and you're winning the victory by being killed. These are the martyrs.
Those who endure to the end.
Now, you can also,
Yeah, that's right.
you can't talk about the 144,000 without Revelation 14.
Yeah.
Which is like the other half of the story about them.
Yeah,
Or
we
should I
see
say
the
more
144,000
detail?
there. The 144,000 in chapter 14 who had his name and his father's name written on their foreheads. And a sound like the roar of rushing water. There were harpists playing their harps. They sang a new song before the throne and before the four living creatures. No one could learn the song except the 144,000 who had been redeemed from the earth. These are those who did not defile themselves with women, for they remain virgins. They follow the Lamb wherever he goes. That's a description of the church. We follow the Lamb wherever he goes. We're like Mary. Or Mary's the other way around, right? Mary had a little lamb. Places light us know everywhere that Mary went, the Lamb was sure to go. We're the opposite of Mary. We follow the Lamb wherever he goes.
The dispensationalists make the argument that, the 144,000 Jews, but then when you see this description, they follow the Lamb wherever they go. Okay, well, I don't know if there's that many Jews on earth today that do that. they're all males, they're all virgins, you know.
You run into a number of problems with the, trying to make the 144,000 specifically Jewish. One of the problems is that the northern 10 tribes were basically lost when Assyria conquered them in 722. They were deported and intermarried. So they have been called the lost tribes with good reason. We don't know where a lot of these tribes are, and it's probably genetically impossible to reassemble them without some kind of God doing some supernatural thing. Which you could argue it's possible that he could do that, but from a practical standpoint, we talk about the Jewish people now. We don't talk about Israel anymore because the Jewish people were made up of the tribes of Judah and Benjamin. So there are two tribes that make up the Jewish people. So you just run into a number of problems trying to make this prophecy a literal fulfillment of 144,000 ethnic Jewish people. And the chapter as a whole fits together much better if you understand this as the beginning of chapter 7 is the army about to go into battle, and the end of chapter 7 is the army that's just come out of battle victorious because they've conquered by allowing themselves to be killed or giving up their lives, even to the point of death, they've remained faithful. So the beginning of battle, going into battle, the end of battle, and they're victorious. And this is what's going on. And one really fascinating thing about chapter 7 that shows you that it's supposed to be all tied together, the end of chapter 6 is what chapter 7 is about. This is the question they were trying to answer. Look at chapter 6, verse 17. For the great day of their wrath has come. This is from God and from Jesus, the Lamb, the wrath of the Lamb, in verse 16. For the great day of their wrath has come, and who can withstand it? Or who can stand? Is most of your other translations will say. That's what being a little bit more literal, and I like that because who can stand is a very vivid question that is answered in chapter 7 in verse 9. After this I looked, and there before me was a great multitude that no one could count, from every nation, tribe, people, and language, standing before the throne and before the Lamb. Who can stand? It's this army that has gone through battle, spiritual battle, and been faithful. Through tribulation, through anything that the enemy could throw their way, they followed the Lamb wherever he went, and they came out of the other side of the war, of the battle, victorious, washing their robes ceremonially, and praising God who led them through it.
You see in chapter 7 at the beginning, the four angels, they're about to, it says the day of the wrath has come, meaning now, right?
Mm-hmm.
So they're about to pour the wrath out, and then the other angel says, "Well, hold on a second. Let's get these guys out of here." And then when you turn to chapter 8, you have a description basically just like chapter 7, where they're starting to hurt the sea and the tree, and exactly in the same order. And so you see 7 between 6 and 8 is like we're talking about 144,000, a great multitude. Get them out of there before the wrath starts. And then in chapter 8, 9 and 10, and some of 11, you see the wrath, the trumpet judgments.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree with that, but I want to take the chronological aspect out because I don't think he's saying that this is the point in time when that happens. This is going back to an overarching perspective of history that you may have been martyred in the 1st century or in the 20th century or in the 25th century if we're around that long. But all of those are this 144,000 that are going into battle, and all of them are in the great multitude at the end who are washing their robes. This is not making a statement about after the sixth seal is opened, then that's when all this stuff happens, and then we go into the 7th seal. You really run into a lot of problems trying to line Revelation up chronologically like that. Even within the same section of judgments, there are things that are repeated and that go back, and it literally cannot be chronological in the order that it's written. And it's not meant to be, that's the point. If John had meant it to be chronological, then he would have probably wrapped up some of those loose ends, like when all the grass is destroyed, and then a little bit later they told not to touch the grass. Something like that. It's like, well, wait a minute, the grass was just destroyed. How did that? Well, the answer is it's apocalyptic imagery of great destruction and upheaval in the world that is going to happen. And is every blade of grass, or 1/3 of the grass, or the locust eating the grass? All of that is really getting bogged down in the minutia of the overall image that Revelation is trying to encourage the church to be faithful in the midst of whatever persecution comes their way.
But the great multitude, would be much easier to understand or receive if verses 5, 6, and 7 through 8. Those are the ones that make it really difficult. And when you start dividing those things into the different types.
Yeah. Well, the number 12 throughout the book of Revelation is used to mean completeness.
Right.
So this is saying a complete number of God's people is the army that's going in there. I mean, the problem that you run into trying to say that from the tribe of Asher, 12,000, is that there is no tribe of Asher anymore.
Right. And where's
So
the
we can't find 12,000, we can't find one person
tribe,
from the
tribe of Dan's not even mentioned?
Yeah.
Well, I was reading a little footnote, as, you know, why they said it wasn't. Because the Antichrist is supposed to come out of there, or it was a reference to idolatry.
Yeah.
I mean, this really gets complicated.
It does. It gets complicated. But if you back up and you look at the whole message of chapter 7, just a hugely encouraging message and very powerful image of going into battle, overcoming battle, the victory celebration at the end. And that's what the church is going through. That's what we're doing. And we're in the middle of that. And we're going to have the celebration at the end if we remain faithful to the end. All right? So, we could spend some...
If you're going to do Daniel, I suggest you do it on Wednesday night, not during Sunday.
We'll see.
2 years.
But,
2 years, exactly.
we could spend a
Daniel's not that
long time
bad.
on all this stuff. But
Daniel's not really that bad.
Yeah.
you know, prophecy is
What's
not
a vision and what's
it's
happening?
it's an important part of Scripture, but it is confusing in its nature, but it's not going to prevent you from understanding the big overall message of the Bible.
Right.
If you feel like you're lost here, just read it and take the parts that you can understand, and then go on to the narrative passages and the doctrinal passages and read those and be edified there as well.
You know what's cool about Daniel is after you do a study of it, as wicked a person as Nebuchadnezzar was, you, after reading the book and studying it, I think will walk away with the opinion that you'll see him in heaven. I think he died saved. I mean, after
I was reading where he said, after he was put out for 7 years and he came back and he said only God.
he wrote chapter 4. A lot of scholars, and I think it even alludes to that in the chapter, but a lot of scholars actually believe Nebuchadnezzar wrote
Isn't that
Daniel chapter
exciting?
4.
If God used him to destroy as an evil person, and boy, if you made me have fingernails that were only
But
lost
he,
my mind and grazed in a pasture for
that was
7
just to
years,
humble him.
I would come around.
that was just a humble
Yeah.
him, and he humbled himself, and now his son's a different story. But
Yeah. All right. Well, thank y'all tonight. I hope it's been interesting for you. We'll hit another topic next week. We'll be done with prophecy. If you want to follow up,
We're done?
feel free to write me an email about prophecy or something like that, and that kind of thing.
That's
But
it?
we'll pray before we head out.
You can stay, Ernie.
That's one of the elders walking out before we pray. Yeah.
Really lost one.
he doesn't have his name tag on. Nobody knows.
Here comes the prayer. I'm out of here.
Yeah, thank you, Lord. Bye.
Father, we thank you for your word and for giving us your revelation that is simple enough for us to understand the most basic message of salvation and of grace through the cross of Jesus Christ and for our sins being forgiven, but is also got enough in it to keep us wondering and scratching our heads for an entire lifetime of study. And I pray that that wouldn't discourage us, but would give us hope that you have put your word together in a fashion that displays your wisdom and your knowledge that is vastly greater and superior than anything that exists here on this earth. And what a great day of rejoicing it'll be in heaven when we are among that great multitude, when we are waving palm branches and washing our robes because we've come through faithful, and we will be able to see not only the things that we can appreciate now, but even the pieces of the puzzle that we didn't even realize were there, and how you've ordered all things for your glory and for our good and for our joy in the gospel of Jesus Christ. So we thank you for your word again. Help us to understand it. Help us to read it. And we ask it in Jesus' name. Amen.